I'm going to open the room, Alex.
Okay, thanks. Welcome everybody. I'm just giving everybody a minute or so to connect. I can see more people joining there as we go along. Welcome to our latest edition of the for ESG Sustainability, our webinar series. Just giving everybody just another few moments to join in. Seeing some familiar names there and faces. Hey Sonder, good to see you. How are you?
I'm fine. The winter blues is kicking in on the West Coast, which is a bit depressing. Questioning the existence of November as a month. I think it's a useless get through it.
The beverage household is currently in full COVID lockdown. We're all suffering from. I'm okay, but yeah, we're all positive, but in the worst kind of way. So yeah, it's winter blues here as well. Hey Aaron, good to see you as well. Yoni, good to see you guys. Excellent. Okay, I think we will get started. I'm sure some other people will join. So as I said, welcome to this episode of ESG the ESG webinar. Thank you everybody for joining, and also thank you also to our sponsors for this event as well. I think it's Sparks who are left there. Hi Kaz, good to see you. Hope it's not too late in Tokyo. Kaz, great. Okay. Could I just ask, we're going to run this as an interview and a small presentation as well, and then we'll do some discussion groups as well. And when we do the discussion groups, it'd be great if everyone could turn on their cameras as well, just to help with the discussion. Everything is off the record and private. However, the more astute of you may have noticed that we are recording this. We're only recording the first half of this episode, which is the interview bit with our two speakers, and then during the discussion we will stop recording just so that you guys can speak your minds, and nothing will appear in the press as well. And I think with that, I will introduce our two speakers today. So they are Dr. David Coe and Richard Buccellato from Rethinking Choices. And the reason I wanted to have them on was because they've just written a really interesting book, which has come out, I think, yesterday, was released yesterday, called The Unsustainable Truth. They had to give me a copy early because it took me ages to read it. But it was a very interesting book, one I highly recommend. Lots of interesting and quite controversial suggestions in there. But let's sort of start at the beginning. David, can I start with you, and then you, Richard? Just give a little bit of your background in terms of your history in finance and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into finance really because I was working as an academic before that. And in '94, had one of the situations where my wife was, or my girlfriend at the time, who was studying Japanese and had finished, was just trying to decide what to do. And we decided that actually, if you study Japanese, you're going to have to use Japanese, otherwise you spend your life regretting it. Which meant at that time, you go to Japan to look for a job. Academic salary doesn't pay for two people to do that. We decided we either split up, we get married. We got married, and then I applied for a job. And this firm called LTCM, whom I didn't know anything about, hired me. Yeah. And then I found out that it was supposed to be the dream team with kind of fed former governors and people, and kind of like all the Salomon Brothers prop team and all of those. So that was kind of how I got into finance.
Through LTC, and then after that, David.
And then I sat through the blow up in LTCM in 98, and actually stayed on as a partner of the fund that we sprung up after. We started with 250 million. We grew to about 2.5 billion by the time I decided it was time to step away from finance in 2007. It just felt like, how was it that someone was describing, when credit spreads start looking like bid-offer spreads, something's gone wrong.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Richard, just briefly, your history in finance.
Oh, it's far less interesting than David's. There are no academic achievements. I couldn't leave university fast enough. And at 22, I started managing financial portfolios, investment risks. I've spent the last 30 years pretty much doing one thing only, which is trade and invest. As my accent gives away, I grew up in Sweden, although I'm Italian, and I worked there the first couple of years of my life in Stockholm. And via Brussels, I came to London about 25 years ago. And it's pretty, narrow, boring career of having managed money for big hedge funds and large investment banks, internal prop teams. And 4 years ago, I joined the hedge fund that David was working for. And our partnership formed there as we looked into various bits and pieces around ESG, really, and decided to delve deeper.
Interesting. Okay, just quickly before we get into that, I was quite interested that David was at the fabled long-term capital management. Obviously, they're very famous for it, for what happened there. But Richard, you were on the other side of that trade, from what I understand, though you guys didn't know each other at the time. Just very briefly, what did it teach you, David, about risk, and what did it teach you about risk, Richard?
Well, we literally were on opposite sides. Richard had basically his best year, and I had kind of probably the worst ever. So I was an academic out of university. I'd actually made some very large amounts of money, and it was in the fund, and we were all into, this was a fund that really believes in leverage.
Yeah.
And it was leverage as big as you can get. And kind of, so for me, what it teaches is leverage is a terrible thing to have when you're facing unknown risks.
Interesting. Richard, what did it teach you, apart from obviously how to make more money?
Yeah, it was fantastic. I loved 98 until we lost on the penalty shootout to the French. It was a great year. Two things really is the takeaway from LTCM and every other financial crisis that we've had ever since is you should always be very wary of consensus positioning. And there are obviously various tools for identifying that. And then the life lesson number one is that leverage works both ways.
Sure. Interesting. Okay. So tell me, how did this project begin? You've written this book, The Unsustainable Truth. It's your own take on the ESG. It's quite controversial in areas. How did that particular project begin?
We started. We were both at this fund together. I rejoined the finance industry after stepping out in 2007. A friend and I actually raised money in the middle of the European debt crisis, and quite a large amount within Henderson. And actually, but then I've realized actually that the way in which the investment world was working didn't really suit me, and I went back into a hedge fund and met Richard there. As everybody in here knows, sustainability has been the theme that has been developing over probably the past 10 years in slow parts. And we got gradually taken along into it by our investors, who were asking us about, what are sustainable investing policy opportunities, what is a sensible policy to have, what are our policies, and we started looking into that. That's basically how it goes. It took several years. Richard?
Yeah, if you're going to be serious about the whole area, you need to align the interest of the three major components, which is your investor, your owners, and your employees. And those three groups do not necessarily always have the same view on what ESG means and what sustainability means. So what started out, we thought as, we'll do this in 3 months or something. We'll write down and nail a proper policy for the fund, and then everyone else can move on and do what we do best, which is make money. Actually turned out to be a much, much longer and deeper conversation about where we were heading, what we were doing, what does these things actually mean, because the only thing everyone agreed on was we wouldn't just have a policy for the sake that people could tick a formula and say, these guys have a policy. That was something everyone was very ardently against. And that was a good starting point, but the hard work really began then. And afterwards, we decided to keep on working, and we formulated Rethinking Choices as a platform for how we can express these ideas. And writing the book actually happened very quickly, mostly because our language is so bad. It required extensive editing, but writing it was very quick.
So, I mean, so much stuff has been written about ESG. Many people are here on this call have written extensively on ESG. You know, there's lots of books about it. Why did you feel that you had to also contribute to that? You know, what did you feel was lacking from probably the literature that you'd read in doing your research?
That's a really kind of good question, because personally, you know, I've never tried writing like this, because precisely for the reason that you were talking about, which is that, you know, there's so much written and all the rest of it. But in the end, what really compelled us was recognizing that actually, you know, may I just hop over to the slide that we were talking about?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. You know, go ahead. It'd be good to get a sort of overview of the issues that you think, you know, are critical in this book.
Yeah, so this is us, and I think that this part where we say, you know, we want to think in terms of the dignity for the person and the environment is very important in why we have this answer in that sense, because in a way we end up asking a question to ourselves: what happens if you cannot achieve sustainability? Is it still worth doing? And I think that's very important to consider, because if you don't ask that question, if our young people, we're having conversations with schools and places as well, and colleges, don't feel that it's worth doing if it's not achievable, then we will only do the wrong things. And I think the best part of it is, you know, what we felt was in the title here, which is we felt increasingly more and more pensions who are our investors and institutional investors who invested in us were asking how to get the best return out of sustainable investing. And what we very, very strongly felt was that if you take everything off the table, all you're going to be left is the sustainability problem. And so investing itself and chasing sustainable investing itself is the problem, why we have a sustainability problem. Mm-hmm. And it's something which really, we really feel it has to be said. And it took us, if you are able to read our book, it took us on a journey where we went back and asked, why do we invest? What are we investing for? And it took us to ask our pensions, the pension investors themselves, and sort of say, look, what other animal in this planet or plant on this planet has a pension? You know, so is it actually our own existence as an investment industry in the way that since the 1970s, we've got into this sort of pension drive part of the problem? You know, Mariana Mazzucato talked a lot about the financialization of the world since the 70s, kind of doesn't associate to the point which we ourselves, as Richard and I, having worked in it for quite a long time. Richard actually came to work in it for 5 decades, which is quite remarkable, where we've seen exactly how our push for diversification went into the commodities and went further into kind of the private capital markets.
Can I just interrupt you there just for 1 second? So one of the things that's interesting about the book is that you, and forgive me if I've got this, if I've got hold of the wrong end of the stick here, but a lot of the ESG products and the ESG policies that you see out there is just simply, you see it as a way of just being able to continue to grow investments, but just do it in a kind of slightly more fluffy way, and a slightly more, you know, acceptable way. But it's not addressing the issue that we need to perhaps accept lower target returns. Is that correct?
Yeah, very much so. Richard?
Yeah, I think that frames it very well. It's we obviously spent a lot of time formulating back then what was Horizon's ESG policy, and a lot of what we see can simply be labeled as pitiful at best, and something far worse if you're a bit mean, because it doesn't really address the underlying issue, which is, if you do think that resources in the world are limited, then you accept that sustainability is an issue. And when you think that extension of the argument through, if resources are limited, current economic model doesn't address that. Because everyone assumes you can have perpetual volume growth.
Okay, and then it'd be interesting just to see how that sort of flows through all the other areas. You've talked obviously about investment and financials, but then how does that work through, if you look through energy, materials, industrials, that sort of thing?
So if you go along and you actually think, well, first of all, this whole problem where as you chase higher returns, what happens as a result of that is, you end up leveraging up more and more, and you end up in societies that's increasingly leveraged. So you end up in situations like there's a report in the US just before the COVID lockdown that says the average American needs to work over 53 weeks a year in order to make enough money for 52 weeks. So there's obviously a little bit of a problem on that. And then the Earth overshoot day this year actually fell for the first time in July. That's the point in the year where we have used up all the resources which the planet can replenish in 1 year. That's obviously another problem. So we, in many respects, in our human world and in our natural world, we're living off borrowed time. And the more we shoot for higher returns, that's going to be a problem. So now if you then go along and you say, how do you go for lower return? You actually have to say, well, what's going to drive you? And you end up asking, what fundamentally is this problem we face? And that I really want to just point out the very last part first. All of these discussions we have had in COP26 and in other conversations and so on, really is talking about how best to use our carbon budget. The carbon budget is the remaining amount of carbon dioxide we can emit into the atmosphere so that it does not exceed 1.5 degrees. And estimates of it ranges from between 6 to 10 years of current emission rate. That's why the IPCC reports has us halving our current emission by 2030. If you think what a electric car does to build one, it embodies about 10 years of carbon emission in it. So building it will mean you've exceeded the carbon budget. There is only one way you can price that in correctly, and that's to cut fossil fuel production, because then you have a demand, you have a supply shock into the system, prices adjust, it gets to be really horrible. And nobody wants to do that, but actually the choice isn't particularly going to be there. So if you work in energy, that means you have to reduce energy consumption, because we don't have all the other choices. We don't have the abundance of energy. And if you really want to be preserving the carbon budget, we have to reserve our energy. You can't consider just posting a dance move on TikTok, which I try to do, as being actually, worth the carbon budget, because someone else is going to need it to make a solar panel or whatever it is. You have to make a choice. And where that then feeds through as you go on to is you can't keep producing new products. You really have to make products that are durable. So when you look at materials, it's not about carbon-free materials, actually about using materials that you have in a very durable way. And that's very different from what we think of. If you then go on to the industrial sectors, and what happens is you don't no longer think about having turnover of products and producing new products, you then have to ask, well, what do people genuinely need a product for? And it cascades down to consumers, where actually what happens then is not, you have to face not more products every year, more growth, but actually lower products and lower growth. Maybe, in 100 years' time, we'd have solved all of this and we can go back to an expansion. But actually, at this particular point, we're facing multiple decades where we're really serious about sustainability. These are some of the consequences we have to consider. Healthcare is a big thing, right? Because we've gone through COVID, we've gone through all the vaccines and everything else. But if you actually go along and ask what's health for, it is about how you can live. Because what happens to healthcare is the healthcare gets more and more expensive. And more expensive means people need more and more money. And people needing more and more money means we need more and more activities and more ways to actually exploit more resources. And so you have a real problem there. And it goes back down to the point where, you know, I've got aches and pains, but I'm okay because I'm busy doing something I want to do. That's a very different attitude towards what healthcare is. Japan really led us in terms of thinking of technology. And here, what it is that you need to, I was just talking earlier and I gave the example of a robot restaurant in Japan. And the robot restaurant, my son showed me this. It was on TikTok.
You're very cool, David. I think we've ascertained that you're very cool. You're on TikTok. No, that's good.
So anyway, so there's this restaurant where robots go around serving people until you actually find out that the people who control the robots are so severely disabled, they are unable to leave their house. Some are unable to leave their rooms. And they control it from far distance away. And many of them have said, you know, this has given me a meaning, a real genuine dignity and purpose. And it actually is really important because without that, without their ability to earn a living themselves, even though it may not be a huge amount or whatever it is, by lowering that hurdle, it really reduces the cost to our welfare, all those taxes and the burdens of all of that. And every country is in a state where it recognizes it's running out of money to pay welfare.
Sure.
And we have an event on the 25th of November about our book that's organized by Urban Ovation, which is a real estate built community platform. And we've been talking to them about actually what ESG means in that environment.
Yeah.
And really it's about community, because that's also hugely important, because you mentioned about 98. You know, the one thing it formed for us, you know, my family, my friends and so on, is when you actually face something that's devastating to your whole way of thinking,
yeah,
and your wealth and everything else, is your friends and your community that can keep you with a sense of humor. And if we think about what we need ahead in terms of where we are, we need the real estate environment, the built environment, because that's where we build genuine community we can really rely on. And for all of that to work, which goes to the end of all of this, is actually, my daughter is 10. On Saturday, she's going into secondary school for a test for their entrance. Everyone is fighting for this. Lots of people at her class have been getting tutors and everything. And there's this idea that this school is so much better than the other one. And that's the problem with the services and utilities when they're driven by pricing. Actually, you need them to be of good basic quality that everyone can trust, because that allows you not to have the high returns that you demand. So that's what drives the very first one, allowing you to lower the demand on your returns. So Richard?
Yeah, I think you went through pretty comprehensively what we think this means for businesses in various sectors. This transition, we hope, for a lot of reasons, should happen fairly quickly. We're not that hopeful because we still sense that people are really seeing the whole area as an opportunity of how to actually generate higher returns. And I was back in Sweden a couple of weeks ago, visited my mom, etc. And I met someone who actually told me, you know, sustainable investing doesn't mean you have to get lower returns. And I thought about it for a second, and David would immediately fill in and say, you know what? Constrained sample universe of stocks would automatically tell you that you can at best be as good, but you certainly cannot be better, because everything you can do outside of this narrower pool, you can also do if you have free accessibility. But it really portrays the mindset of how people in a country which is generally being labeled as be at the forefront of the ESG movement is thinking about it. This is an opportunity for me to actually show people that I can generate higher returns without sacrificing anything. But in truth, we go back to the area with the limited resources and what the top row says here in investments and financials. Like, if we are really serious about this and not exceeding the carbon budget, in our world, we cannot see any other way forward than significantly lower returns. because at the end of the day, you need to take the money from somewhere that you are going to give back to your shareholders, or in our case, the pension members, etc. It needs to come from somewhere. We don't really believe in alchemy.
I mean, that's really interesting, and I'm sure there's lots of people got views on that, because we've often talked about how you can make money from ESG. We've discussed the term ESG alpha more than once, and this is a theme we talk about as well. But before we get onto that, and before I bring everybody else in, when you also presented for us at our European Investment Roundtable in Copenhagen, and you had a very specific, quite audacious proposal around managing carbon stocks, carbon investments. Could you just give us a very quick, if you can, outline of that? What's the plan? Is this your program to close the emissions gap?
Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, we truly and utterly believe in capitalism. That's a cornerstone of our economic thinking. So you need a capitalist solution to what essentially is the biggest portfolio problem we have. Because if you see that global warming and the using up of the carbon budget is the biggest threat you have to any future, not only well-being, but keeping it strictly capitalist here and say, this is the biggest threat we have to future portfolio returns. You address this issue now. And, like most people who have spent 30 plus years managing risk, I've encountered tough periods. If you have a portfolio issue that's not performing and actually you're drawing down, and for a real money manager, that would be underperforming your benchmark. In the hedge fund world, it's not making money or losing money. You need to address those issues. You need to face up and deal with that problem. The sooner you do it, the better your portfolio will perform. Everyone knows that, and still people don't do it because somehow it's hard to take stop losses. It's hard to deal with bad positions. And this is a bad position that's going to come back and kill your portfolios for a long, long time, because ultimately planetary risks, you cannot hedge them, you cannot divest them. And they're certainly not diversifiable.
and the key part to what Richard's saying is that it's not about divesting, because actually you can't divest it. Someone else holding the thing still creates the carbon, so it gets you nowhere. In fact, it gets you worse, because the guy who holds it wants the income from it, and this is the key part to this. So supposing you went along and you got a company to go along and say, okay, we're going to cut Shell, BP, whoever, and you're going to say Exxon. Actually, ideally Exxon would be fantastic. You go along and you say, okay, we're going to cut production, and we do it along the lines IPCC says, maybe 1% this year, 2% next year, or whatever it is, and some gradual tapering that you have along. Then what's going to happen is that the oil price is going to shoot up. As a result, you now got a supply shock on the system, and the oil price is going to shoot up. So if you're a shareholder and you've got a lot of income now coming in, you've got an ethical question: can you take that money? To us, you can't take that money. You might have done the right thing in cutting the carbon emission, but you've also, in doing so, caused a lot of harm to a lot of people in doing so. There's only one place that money can legitimately go to, which is to the agencies which are doing their best to help people across the transitions. So what should happen is that you should have shareholders go along and propose to cut production and to nominate a entity, a UN entity, development agency, or a charity, a faith charity, or a secular charity, or it could be the state welfare fund itself, or whatever it is, to be recipients of those shareholder income. So shareholders essentially become owners of a green token that they can nominate along. Now, this proposal along doesn't actually require anything other than those two elements, that you cut the production and you nominate those shareholder income. It's important to consider how much this costs. the MSCI ACWI index, which is all global kind of investable companies of a meaningful size and so on, the energy sub-index is 3% of the total index. That means that this year, you know, if the index had made about, you know, close to 20%, call it 17%, it means that you take home this year 14% instead of 17% in your portfolio. So it's a one-off gift, one-off cost of that, of those 3%. For that, the income that you're going to make available is basically now new money. And it's going to add, from Richard and I estimate, to, you know, close to $1 trillion over the coming couple of decades or so. And that's without accounting for how much oil prices might go up as a result of this action. And this is new money that now goes to help people. So if you look at COP26 and all the cries of why can't we get 100 billion from people, here's $1 trillion that you can actually make available to the agencies involved. And if you now look at your own portfolio and says, "Ooh, I'm really overweight oil," what you should do is to get out, you know, sell those shares off, because those shares are going to become the shares of a zero value company. If you're the management of a company, what this proposal does to you is nothing apart from committing cut production. Carry on with the capital expenditure, carry on with your renewable projects, spin those off for profit, do all those things that you may like. It doesn't restrict it. If you're a government, the tax revenue from the company still flows out to you. So your responsibility of the pledges and to take care of your people still continues. So the only people who give up their economic benefit are the shareholders, and what they're giving up to a shareholder of a diversified global portfolio is something like 2–3%. And that's what it's asking them to do as a one-off thing, so that for the next 10–20 years, they can go along and say, Sahara needs Africa needs a bit more. Greta's been telling me, so I'm going to switch some out of Sweden to them instead. And, you know, that's basically what the proposal is. How do you bring it about? Don't lobby the management, lobby the shareholders. If you don't have any shares, your friend might do, talk to your friend. You know, if you're a student and you know your parents have a lot of such shares in their pensions, talk to your parents. So talk to the shareholders, make this a global debate amongst people, not a closed door debate between board members and management. Because in the end, the people who own the companies are the shareholders. So here we've got a link, do go there and have a look.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you very much. Sorry, Richard, did you want to come in there?
No, as an aside, if you look back over the last 30–40 years, energy as a share of the overall index has really only been lower in the last year. We probably hit the low point in the valuation of energy about a year ago, more or less exactly to the day. And it's been going up a bit since, but it's not much. If you go back to the 70s, energy was in excess of 20% of the global index. Now it's sub 3%. So it's actually never, ever been cheaper to take the stop loss than it is now.
Okay, no, that's great. On that note, I think we'll stop recording now so we can have a sort of more open discussion. It'd be good to get some people's views. If you're able to stop